begin a series of 6 programs, Politics in the 70s, which will be broadcast at this time on Sunday evenings. Robin Day introduces the series and the program.
For the first of this series of political dialogues, I have with me 2 of the most brilliant and controversial parliamentarians of our time, Mr. Enoch Powell and Mr. Michael Foot. And this is one of the rare occasions that they've faced each other in a broadcast discussion of this kind. Our program now is the opening one in a series about politics in the 70s, which will feature not only Mr. Powell and Mr. Foot, who are with me now, but also Mr. Roy Jenkins and Mr. Reginald Maudling, who will join in later programs. These 4 well-known figures between them span a wide spectrum of political opinion. And in this series they will be debating, either in pairs or in a group of 4, about their individual attitudes to some of the main political issues currently facing the country and their respective political parties. In beginning with Mr. Powell and Mr. Foot, we have 2 men who, to many people, appear to represent opposite extremes of political philosophy. Michael Foot, the passionate left-wing socialist, follower and biographer of Aneurin and Bevan. Enoch Powell, the radical of the right, who preaches his own philosophy of conservatism and capitalism, which has come to bear his name. Yet, despite the philosophical gulf between them, Michael Foot and Enoch Powell have much in common. They are both devoted upholders of the rights of Parliament. They are both gifted and eloquent debaters, whose name on the electronic indicator is a signal for MPs to hurry back into the Commons chamber to hear them speak. Both are journalists and authors who have written political history. They have both, at different times, clashed with their party's official policy. But perhaps, and most interesting of all, they have in recent times found themselves on the same side in some of the big parliamentary battles, against the common market, for instance, against incomes policy, and against, some years ago, reform of the House of Lords. So I want to ask a preliminary question to you, Michael Foot. Do you not find it distasteful, or at least strange, to find yourself fighting on the same side as Enoch Powell?
Well, it may sometimes be strange. Of course, we have some subjects on which we are deeply and passionately opposed. The principal one perhaps being race and immigration, another one being the whole working of the market economy. But your question is about matters on which we may find some agreement. Take, first of all, the House of Lords or the common market. I think the common strand that affects our views on these matters is that both of us, at least I'm certainly opposed, and I'm sure Enoch Powell is opposed, to the destruction of the House of Commons, its power and its authority as an instrument of democracy in this country. And I believe that powerful forces and powerful people are engaged in trying to destroy the House of Commons. Mostly they're doing it unwittingly, but that's the consequence of what they're doing. And that was what happened in the debates on the House of Lords and on the common market.
Enoch Powell, do you accept that as a common strand between you? And do you find it distasteful being on the same side as Michael Foot?
One never finds it distasteful to have allies, especially powerful and persuasive allies. So give me allies. I think it's most instructive to take each of these subjects separately. And while I agree with Michael Foot about the common strand, for example, between our joint opposition to entry into the EEC and to the 68 proposals for reform of the House of Lords, even those 2, I think, are worth taking apart. Let's look at the House of Lords for a moment. Now, I'm quite sure that both of us regarded the proposals for reform as an attack upon the House of Commons. We saw them as bound to put more power in the hands of the executive and to increase its independence of the House of Commons. And by its independence of the House of Commons, I mean its possibility of being indifferent to debate, questioning, giving account in the House of Commons.
And yet you oppose the legislation from diametrically opposed philosophical point of view.
Exactly so. I've no doubt that in his philosophy, Michael Foot would uphold the workability, perhaps the desirability of a second chamber. I approach this from the point of view of what Burke called prescription. I regard the power, the rights of institutions as prescriptive, as deriving from what has come to be. And in that sense, I suppose we exemplify the difficulties both of, we have to use the word sooner or later, the left and the right. The right finds it easy to explain what is, and to justify what is, but not to account for change. The left finds it easy to justify change, but not to account for what is and what is accepted. So there you have an example where we coincided in opposition and where there was a genuine emotional coincidence. We were defending the same thing and saw ourselves as defending the same thing. And yet if you'd asked us, well, what do you want to do instead? We would probably have given very different answers.
Michael Foot?
Yes, I'm sure that we would give different answers. I wasn't against the reform of the House of Lords because I thought the present House of Lords is an institution that needed to be defended at all. I would be very glad to see it consigned to final oblivion. What I was opposed to, and where we overlap partly, is that the so-called reform proposals would, of course, have not merely strengthened the House of Lords as against the House of Commons, but they would have tended to corrupt the House of Commons in the sense that the executive would have had enormous sway over the House of Commons. However, I do not entirely agree with what Enoch Powell says about the difference between the left and the right, about their view on institutions. I believe that the traditions of democracy and freedom in this country, which in my judgment in history have been contributed mainly from the left, are very powerful forces in framing the way in which the left reacts to these situations, and it is because of that I believe the left is a much better defender of freedom. Indeed, the elaboration of the freedoms we have in this country have usually had to be fought for, and we had to fight against somebody in order to achieve them as well, and it was mostly the Tories who wished to preserve what was in the past, and of course we wouldn't have had our freedoms if we hadn't had those fights.
There are two very revealing things in what Michael Foot's just said. First, he's shown what I've always suspected, but never found explicit, that he does accept prescription, tradition, he used the word, as a framework within which he, from his point of view, as well as I from mine, cannot but wish to operate. And indeed, I've suspected this because a man can't be the great parliamentarian that Michael Foot is unless he has a respect for institution as institution and for tradition. I don't mean mindlessly, but for tradition as a framework, maybe a framework which you shake, which you alter, but still a framework from which you start. I thought that was very significant. And the other thing was the chopping block theory, if I might so describe it. And this, of course, is the insoluble dilemma of all of us in the House of Commons. And when Michael Foot and I look at one another across the floor of the House, I suspect we say to ourselves, that is, whoever it is that's saying it, I know jolly well that my theory of society, my view of the future, my hopes and aspirations are those that not only ought to prevail, but shall prevail. But by Jove, you know, I couldn't do without him. Because how could there be government by debate, which is perhaps the essence of British parliamentary democracy? But how could there be something much deeper than that? A synthesis. I can't be all right, although I have to say, although I have to argue 100% in the House of Commons and at an election. But I know deep down that what has to come out of it is going to be an unforeseeable amalgam between what I have to say and what my opponents have to say. In a sense, Michael Foot and I, perhaps to one another also.
Do you like that idea of your contribution to Mr. Powell's democratic activities?
Well, I think that's a side effect. It's not the purpose of the operation. The Parliament it holds the country together, and that is what where both of us may be agreed. If you do not have the fights and tussles in the country and the struggles in the country compressed and mirrored in Parliament, they will take place somewhere else, and that is that they will take place by force. And I am opposed to that. Indeed, I believe the whole progress of civilization is to settle matters by persuasion rather than by force. But that does not mean, as some illiterate observers of the House of Commons suggest, that the place becomes a cosy arrangement between those who, because they are forced into proximity, therefore their views collude. That is not the case. Indeed, one of the extraordinary facts about the House of Commons is that you are forced to listen to extremely disagreeable arguments put from the other side, and that does not necessarily make you wish to prove those arguments, but it does force you very often to go out and think, what is the answer to that argument, and how am I going to present a case which stands up against that? And that is the difficulty of the place and the challenge of the place, and what, I'm sorry to say, the leaders of so many of the parties, headed by the Liberal Party, which doesn't seem to care about these matters at all, are chucking away altogether. They don't seem to recognise what are the virtues of the place, because these are the things they are most damaging, both by their attack on the House of Lords and even more by the common market arrangement, which is, of course, a plan to hand over essential democratic controls over life in Britain to unrepresentative institutions.
Now, may I come to a point you mentioned at the beginning, the question of race and immigration. Now, this is one of the questions on which you would violently disagree with Mr. Powell, even though you may respect him as a parliamentarian within the parliamentary atmosphere. Now, do you not think that Mr. Powell has made any useful contribution to society by raising this issue into the open? Or do you think it's an odious and disagreeable thing that he's done?
Well, I think there are a lot of people in the country who agree with him, and therefore that is his excuse, if you like to put it that way, for saying what he says. And those of us who take a strongly opposite point of view have to take account of that fact. But my disagreement with him is based on two fundamental matters, one touching on what we've already discussed. That is to say, I believe the way in which he puts his case on this subject is destructive of the community, in the sense that more and more of the coloured people in this country are born in this country. They are citizens of this country. They should have absolutely equal rights with everybody else in this country. And if they are singled out as being a section of the community that is disruptive, or that should be sent back to places where, in fact, they weren't born, that is disruptive of the community itself. The second reason why I'm so strongly opposed to what he says is that I believe that all the great immigrations that have come to this country have been highly beneficial to this country, whether you take the Huguenots or the Jews or the Irish. All the people who've come to make the mongrel nation that we are have greatly contributed to the variety and greatness of English or British life.
Mr. Powell, disruptive, destructive, and contrary to our tradition of welcoming immigrants who have been useful to us.
I'd be fascinated to know where Michael Foot would stand on this, and I'm not impugning anything at all that he's said, if he had happened to be, for example, a member of Parliament for Wolverhampton or one of the Birmingham seats. And he's quite entitled to say that he could give me examples of people who agree utterly with him and who represent such constituencies. Nevertheless, this, unlike the other subjects we're discussing, is a subject which found me, and I didn't go looking for it. And there are two aspects to it. There are two aspects on which people can rationally differ. One is fact, and I think it's important not to overlook this. After all, it was only very recently that the facts as to magnitude were elicited. And in the middle 1960s, it was my own realization that I had been mistaken as to the facts, had been misled and misled myself as to the numerical facts, which produced a very sharp reaction in my own mind and drove me, I would say, to bring this subject to the fore and to press it upon colleagues. Now, one can argue about facts in one sense in order to establish them. Then the other aspect is one's deduction or view or projection from those facts. Now, there can be debate about that, but there obviously can't be resolution except after the event. Now, Michael Foot referred to other immigrations. I just would like to say that even if you take the largest of them, absolutely and proportionately, which was that of the Jews, the beginning of this century and in the 1930s, and by the way, I had some little hand in assisting Jews to come to this country in the 1930s, they are insignificant proportionately, let alone other aspects, with the Commonwealth immigration of the last 15 or 20 years. And therefore, however strong are the differences, I think one has to start by recognizing this factual basis, even though one may still disagree on the projections. I disagree on the projections because I believe the nature of this massive immigration is that as time goes on, the trend, I hate to use the word, but I'm going to use it inevitably, is not going to be towards but away from assimilation. Now, I can't prove that, but if I believe it, I have to speak, act, argue, advise accordingly.
You're going to get segregated communities, you mean?
I fear we are bound to.
Michael Foot, do you think that's answered your particular points about disruption and destructiveness?
No, I don't think it's answered them, and of course it wouldn't be much sense in our having the full argument about the numbers and the rest now. I disagree in the comparisons, and I think not taking any particular number that I can disprove what Enoch Powell says by taking the Irish immigration. If you take proportionately, the Irish immigration, I should say, is far greater than the coloured immigration of the past 20 years. The Irish immigration has been very big in many areas. Now, some people say, oh, well, the Irish should have never have come here. But, of course, the people who say that probably were immigrants from somewhere else, too. Most of us are immigrants in one form or another, if you go back far enough. And the Irish immigration, a very big one, has contributed very greatly, in my opinion, to the general variety of this country. If you take the labour movement of this country, it would be very much poorer if it hadn't been for the Irish contribution. And so I believe that the assimilation of other peoples in our country has been to the untold benefit of our country, as long as we determine to assimilate and to allow them to be assimilated, of course.
And as long as they wish it.
Ah, yes, of course. And coming back to the philosophical point, if you like, in my opinion, it is contrary to the general theme of a lot of other things that Enoch Powell says, that he should be acting or speaking in this manner, because it is contrary to the idea of trying to sustain the British community as one community.
Could I put this point to you, Michael Foot? You are a Democrat. I don't know whether you ever use the phrase trust the people, but you believe in the popular will, and you want the people to take over things. How do you get round this point that a great many people, probably a great many people in Ebbw Vale, who are your supporters, think that Enoch Powell is right? And does that cause you to think again?
Well, of course, a lot of them do, and a lot of them share his view, and there's no point in disputing the fact. Large numbers of people in the country do, and if anybody like myself were to condemn them, it would be a scandalous situation, because they are entitled to express their views too. But, in my opinion, and I think Enoch Powell would probably agree with this, it isn't the business of politicians merely to go around and find out what the popular will is. Business of politicians is to say what they think is good for the country and the world, or the cause in which they believed, as clearly as they can. And if we go around searching for the popular will, we'll never find it. Hazlitt said something like, the public is so much thinking of what it may be thinking that it's not allowed the right to think at all. And that's very often what does happen. So public opinion polls, popular wills expressed in that manner, don't influence me in this question at all.
Enoch Powell, one final point on this subject.
Well, I was going to come off the subject by pointing out that hence the importance arising out of what Michael Foot's just said of an institutional framework in which opinion is expressed and decisions are reached. And certainly neither he nor I, though we regard the House of Commons as the ultimate expression of popular will, if one must have such a vague expression, and we honour it ultimately, I think, for that reason. We would not be alarmed to find ourselves advocating a cause which was only sustained by a small minority of our constituents. And in fact, you didn't mention this amongst the matters on which we agree. We've both voted, I believe, steadily for the abolition of capital punishment, a subject on which I'm well aware that I don't represent. I'm pretty convinced that I don't represent the opinion of the majority of my constituents. Now, there is a point, and this is back to the issue, there is a point, I don't believe it's yet been reached, at which if there were sufficiently widespread and profound public revulsion and indignation that even I, who am a convinced abolitionist, would say, this is the lesser evil.
Could I come to one issue on which, in the public mind, probably divides you more than any other? That is your attitude to how the economy should be run, the ownership of industry and the ownership of wealth. Do you see any point in common between you there, or do you accept this as a total division?
Well, I think there's one point in common, curiously, and that is that partly because both of us do believe in the authority of the House of Commons, that we are opposed to the transfer of essential powers over the economy into other institutions. Doesn't mean to say that the other institutions shouldn't exist at all, but they should all be properly subordinate to the elected House of Commons.
Which did you mean?
Well, I mean these prices and incomes boards that are set up that have got enormous powers and they're not answerable to Parliament at all. Either we go to, I believe, to a socialist state or a corporate state. Now, I think Enoch Powell thinks, although he's capable of speaking for himself, as we've sometimes discovered, that he thinks that we should return to a laissez-faire economy of some sort. I don't believe that's going to be possible, and I think the development of Heath, who, after all, a few years ago claimed to be a strong, diligent, devoted supporter of the market economy in its most extreme form, the way in which he has been forced to change is an indication that there's got to be a different choice. But unfortunately, of course, he's making the wrong choice because he's got so little respect for the democratic institutions of the country that he's quite prepared to see, and indeed likes the idea of everything being pushed into these corporate state institutions.
Is there a choice, as you see it, Enoch Powell, between the corporate state and the socialist state, or isn't there something called the mixed economy?
What I've always found difficult to understand, not only about Michael Foot, but about many of my socialist opponents with whose ultimate standards I broadly agree, is that they can conceive a socialist state in which the very liberties which they actively defend could be preserved. I understand something of a distinction which we're trying to express when we use the terms corporate and socialist. Nevertheless, if the state is going to determine the course and content of the economy, then, in my view, willy-nilly, it will transfer from individuals and from automatic mechanisms decisions over people's lives so that they become arbitrary decisions of power. And by their very nature, these decisions will be unappealable. Now, Michael Foot and I both hate prices and incomes boards because they take arbitrary, unappealable, unjusticiable, in the last resort, undebatable decisions and impose them upon people. Now, to me, the virtue of a market system is not the beauty of a splendid machine functioning effortlessly and accurately like a computer. Not a bit. I regard it as a very makeshift affair, if you like. But at least I do regard it as the preferable alternative method of getting economic decisions taken to a series of state institutions, whether socialist or corporate, which are going to find themselves imposing an arbitrary will upon a people and upon its development.
Could I just inject a thought here that the things like the Prices and Incomes Board and similar institutions are, in the minds of those who set them up, institutions set up by Parliament to defend the interests of the people, the consumer, against the powerful forces of capitalists and trade unionists and so on, and therefore it's a very sensible democratic thing to have. Neither socialist nor corporate, but common sense to have some kind of regulation in the public interest.
I'm in favour of regulations in the public interest. One of the questions is how you do them and how you keep control over the bodies that you give the powers to. But on the general subject, of course, as a socialist, I think it is absolutely essential to mobilise the power of the state or the community, whichever you like to call it. The community is the democratic expression of the state. But Enoch Powell referred to the constituencies from which we come. If he came from a constituency in South Wales, he wouldn't talk about the great virtues of the market economy with quite such ease as he sometimes does, because we've seen it the market economy almost wrecked Wales, South Wales, in the 20s and the 30s, the Great Depression, which is not forgotten. And we've seen now in modern times how huge industrial changes, technological changes, can only be put through if the community steps in some form or other to prevent these changes being pushed through in a manner which grinds people to pieces.
But a nationalised industry has also done harm to your constituency.
Yes,
in your
yes,
view,
it has
hasn't
indeed.
The
That's
steel.
one of the and we have to control that too. We've at least got a chance of changing over from one industry to another, or one set of industries to another, under the kind of arrangements we've got now. If the industry was in private hands, it might have been closed down overnight without any possibilities. All the redundancy payments, all the proposals for bringing in alternative industries, all these arrangements of assistance and subsidies, all these are interventions with the market economy. And of course, these great areas of the country would be devastated. Now, Enoch Powell, I know, thinks, despite his saying that he doesn't think it's such a perfect machine, he still thinks that the pressures of trade unions and these organizations doesn't have much effect on the way this powerful market economy works. And that, I believe, is his fundamental error. That view will never be accepted by the British people.
Do you admit to that fundamental error, Mr. Powell?
I must say I've enjoyed the spectacle in the House of Commons in recent months of Michael Foot tearing into the nationalised steel industry. And I couldn't help thinking as I listened to it, you know, the Ebbw Vale steelworks, like the Shotton steelworks, they'd love the opportunity to have a go. They'd love the opportunity to discover, by trial and error, by attempting to make a profit under those conditions, or find alternative directions in which to make a profit, to show that there was life in the old dog yet, and to show that there were possibilities and hopes that a central mechanism couldn't imagine. And it is really choice. My greatest fear of socialism is that its choices and its vision, which will be no wider than those of a little set of men somewhere, politicians perhaps democratically elected, but still a little set of men, will fall very far short of the possibilities of the real world, which people will find out for themselves, but can only find out through the capitalist mechanism.
Well, the real world involves how investment is to be made and on what scale it is to be made in the great industries of the country. Those decisions might have been made 20 or 30 years ago in amongst private bodies, these little little groups of people sitting aside carefully looking at these matters. It might have been decided 30 or 40 years ago like that. Now, the decisions of how much you're going to invest in coal and steel and all these things...
And Concord?
Yes, they
and
have
Maplin?
They have to be... Yes, whether you're going to do it or not, whether you're going to want to do Maplin, you can decide yes or no. But this has to be done by the state in some form or other, because the sums involved are so huge that no individual can provide them. Talk of the real world, it's Enoch Powell who lives in a fantasy world, because he's thinking it's the same as in the days of Adam Smith. Nothing of the sort. Now the question is, who is going to control these vast corporate funds? Who is going to control these multinational companies? Are we going to mobilize the power of the independent, sovereign, democratic state in this country to help to do so?
You can still use the phrase independent, democratic, sovereign state, can you, even though we've joined the common market?
We will have to recover some of the powers that we've wantonly thrown away. That's, of course, one of the main objectives that I'm after. If we decide to proceed with entry into the common market and along the lines laid down, we will not have the power, because the power will have been transferred to the Commission and the Council of Ministers in Brussels. That's what they're after, and they don't want it answerable to any effective democratic assembly. That's why they took away the powers from the House of Commons. But we have to recover them, and if we don't recover them, certainly we are going to be at the mercy of these great multinational companies. The only power in the present modern world which can stand up to the conglomerations of capital is the power of the individual states.
Mr. Powell, do you
Who
agree
is
with
to
that?
control them, says Michael Foot, and that's the question indeed. Now, my answer still is that over the application of great masses of capital, and particularly new capital, because it's new capital that matters. The future of the country is determined not by so much by what we do by the existing capital, that's over the dam, but where we put the new savings, year by year, the fruits of our current endeavour. Now, who's to control that? My answer is that it is much safer that should be controlled by the necessity of showing a plus rather than a minus, than that it should be controlled by any organisation, even though that be ultimately responsible to a political body like the House of Commons. And it simply isn't true that the size of the aggregations of capital alters this. After all, what amount of capital is in the petrochemical industries in this country? The state would not have decided to put into the exploration and exploitation of a resource which we didn't know of, the capital which the petrochemical industry has put into it. It's true, of course, that compared with 200 years ago, the aggregations of capital are far greater, but they are still just as accessible to the discipline of the market, to the necessity of being ultimately accountable through the market to the customer. And I am less fearful of that accountability than of accountability through political channels. And I think that is where the gulf between us lies.
Even though, as a result of that, the system you would prefer, communities collapse, large number of people get out of work and
they
so
do
on.
that anyhow.
The idea that these aggregations of capital are really operating just like a lot of entrepreneurs in the 19th century is nonsense. What happens is the aggregations of capital want to become bigger aggregations. If they find they're losing in a particular battle, then they extend their activities even further. That's the meaning of the multinational companies like the ITT company and the rest that have been described in recent times. Then what those great companies do is to go ahead and try and suborn the state itself, which maybe is the explanation fundamentally of Watergate and all the events that are taking place in the United States. That is the example of how big capital, out of control, not answerable to democratic institutions at all, goes out to take over the state itself. Now, that is what we are faced with, and that is why you can't answer that in 19th century Adam Smith terms.
Your mention of Watergate and democratic institutions lead me on to another thought. We've been watching the Watergate crisis develop, or some people have in this country, with some complacency, yet we've had a number of problems in this country in recent months, which have caused people to question how democracy is working in this country and the general morality and integrity of public life. Do you go along with this often expressed cliche that there is a disillusionment with parliamentary politics? Has it got to do with a nasty smell at the top, or is it just the thing that often happens between elections and so on?
Well, I don't think it's helpful to put into one ragbag assorted things like Watergate, Lonhro, Poulsen, Jellicoe and all the rest, and shake them up together and say, what do you think of that? I think these things have got to be taken apart. But there is one relevant strand which I think I discern, and it connects with other subjects that we've been discussing. I do fear for the self-respect of politics, because I fear for the self-respect of the House of Commons. And this brings me personally, and I think it brings Michael Foot, straight back to the EEC and the surrender of the accountability of government to the House of Commons and the ultimate legislative and taxing power of the House of Commons. I am ashamed that the House of Commons did not, in the last session, say anything else but not this. We are not going to be members of the last independent House of Commons of the United Kingdom. And if you like to examine how this could come about, then I think you do detect a number of strands and changes which have been taking place over the last 20 or 30 years, which help to account for it. I do think there's been an increase in a mistaken kind of professionalism. the view that to be a member of the House of Commons is a profession like any other. What's the rate for the job? Well, we've got to have just as good pay as you could get in any other comparable employment with our talents and so on. Of course, we've got to have a pension at the end of it. And if we're not in politics, well, then we have a right to expect to be a seat on a board, whether it be a nationalised board or a board of a company. I think this is a devaluation of a characteristic of politics in Britain which has differentiated Britain from other countries to our immense advantage, perhaps, let's say, to go no further, for the last 2 centuries, and that somehow one has to recover the sheer pride in being a member of this sovereign assembly, a pride so great that there's no sacrifice you won't make in order to be and remain a member of it. So if you're looking for a common characteristic of this assortment, I would find it in what I've tried to diagnose as a loss of pride.
Well, is it a loss of something else? Have recent events of one kind or another, although you said they weren't really connected, and of course I don't suggest that they are connected, don't you think there is a feeling among a great many people that public and political life is not as honest or as clean, and its standards, and indeed commercial life too, its standards aren't as high as they have felt entitled to expect? Mr. Powell, just before Michael Foot comes in again.
Well, surely the two things hang together. If you respect yourself and are seen to behave in a self-respecting way, others will respect you. Now, of course, always people have said of members of Parliament, they vote with the party, they follow the whip, they're out to feather their nest. I mean, this is common parlance in all times and in all circumstances. But is there not more reality in it now than there was a generation or 2 generations ago? It's a question which no doubt every generation asks itself. My answer is, I fear there is. And I fear that a mark of this debasement is that Parliament could do what it did in the last session, in ceding what it ceded, in order to join the community on these terms and in this way.
Michael Foot.
Well, I agree with part of what Enoch Powell's description of the disease, but not with his particular cure, because I don't think there's anything wrong to say that about having professional politicians. Indeed, the politicians who've normally kept the House of Commons going, not merely in the last 20 years or so, but all through its history, or at any rate its history going back to the 18th century, have mostly been the professional politicians, the people who applied most of their full time to the operation. I'm not saying that the other people didn't contribute to the place, but they were the people who actually kept it going. Charles James Fox, William Pitt, not that I think he's a very good example to anybody, Lloyd George and the others, they were professional politicians. Now, the decline in the place is pride in... Certainly that's declined, but that's associated with power. So the whole thing, in my opinion, comes back to this question of the power of the House of Commons. If the power resides there, the people will come there to operate it, and the people outside, that is the general public, the mass of the people, they will be interested in the election and whether they are properly represented if they can see that the real power resides there. And we as socialists have always claimed that more and more power should be handed to the elected representatives of the people, and less power should be left in the hands of other institutions like the city and the rest. That is why it is so deplorable that we should have joined in the House of Commons as a whole in handing away so much power without even apparently understanding what we were doing on the Common Market Bill. And I entirely agree with Enoch Powell. I am ashamed to have been a member of the House of Commons and to have seen it give away its power so wantonly, not knowing what it was doing, flippantly.
Is it fair to say flippantly when people who are as sincere and dedicated as you took the opposite view, including about 70 members of your own party?
The members of my own party who did it, they voted both ways, actually, so they haven't got so much claim to protect themselves from the argument. They had to argue the matter out in political parties. The only way you can run the House of Commons is through the operation of political parties. Edmund Burke understood that, and we ought to understand it just as well. The party system is not merely a creditable system, it is the only way in which democracy can be sustained at all, and therefore the minority in the Labour Party on this subject ought to have understood that as well as some of us have had to understand it. But in any case, not to recapitulate the whole argument, it is indisputable that the powers we gave away first to the institutions in Brussels, but even more to our own executive, were done on a scale which has never been done in the history of Parliament before. And some of us will devote the rest of our lives to recover that power because we think that mistake was so disastrous. And if we succeed in recovering that power, and in the process of recovering that power, we will, in my belief, restore self-respect and even affection for our democratic institutions. The great thing about Parliament, partly because of its history, is it commanded not merely respect, but the affection of the British people. I think that has gone and has got to be recovered.
Do you think that there is less respect among the public now for Parliament and politics and public life?
Well, I think for the reasons I've described that it is so. I don't think it is because of the other concatenation of events that you mentioned, because I could go back into history and ransack events of similar character which had occurred at various times. But what has not occurred since the 17th century, what has not occurred is that the House of Commons itself should agree to hand away its powers on such a scale. It's never been done since the days when we were ruled by divine right.
You're both in agreement to this, so perhaps I may be permitted to put a point to you. In doing what you call handing away its powers, has not Parliament used that sovereign power to do what the majority of the Parliament wanted to do, namely join the community? And why is that a bad exercise of the sovereign power, particularly as you were saying earlier, it can take it back and it is still sovereign, and indeed you have said you will devote the rest of your life to changing it?
Well, partly because that is a misunderstanding, as both Enoch Powell and I tried to explain during the course of the debates, that the power of the House of Commons does not reside solely in the question of being able to overthrow a government in the last resort. Of course, that's a very important power. The power of the House of Commons depends on being able to examine in detail the legislation that is brought before it, and that is specifically what we have given away. The legislation about the size of lorries, about food prices, is all handed away from the House of Commons, and yet these are the very subjects that the public want to discuss.
Before I invite Enoch Powell, one of your pro-European colleagues, Mr. Michael Foot, might make the, you might call it a cheap debating point, that if you were at the European Parliament, you'll be able to do something about that legislation. But Enoch Powell.
Well, you've made the main point. That, of course, if we had become part of a new nation with heart and soul, and if that new nation had a self-expression such as the House of Commons has come to be of the British nation, then indeed what Michael Foot and I are arguing about and contending for would be dissolved in a greater reality.
May I make one final comment to you both, gentlemen? The things which unite you are stronger felt by you than the things which divide you, and I think this is very interesting.
Well, my answer to that is that I don't believe you can tabulate these matters in such a way. It is because the immediate question that we've been discussing is the attack upon the House of Commons. I'm sure we could have extremely furious arguments about many other subjects.
But you spoke with greater passion in favour of that than you did when you attacked Mr. Powell on the free economy, for instance.
Well, I like him at the beginning. I don't mind having allies in defending the House of Commons, particularly when there are so many deserters.
Besides, this is the fundamental. Parties come and go, governments come and go. But if we lose the power to make and unmake governments, to make and unmake parliaments, then everything else is changed. Even if I were convinced that the result of doing what Michael Foot has described, regaining what we ought never to have given away, even if I were convinced that the result of that would be that we would have Labour administrations for the rest of my lifetime, I would say, well, so be it. Mm-hmm. But at least we have retained the power to decide under what general principles this nation is going to be governed.
Would you rather have a Labour government in this country which took Britain out of the common market than a Conservative government which did not, Mr. Powell?
Well, we shall know as the coming months unroll whether that is the form in which the choice is going to be presented to the electorate and to all of us.
Well, there we must end this discussion. Thank you very much, Michael Foot and Enoch Powell. This is the first of our series, Politics in the 70s. Mr. Powell and Mr. Foot will be heard again in later programmes in this series, along with Mr. Roy Jenkins and Mr. Reginald Maudling. And it is they who will be debating together next Sunday at this time. What is the difference between a social democrat like Mr. Jenkins and a Tory moderate with the so-called consensus policies of Mr. Reginald Maudling? On the big issues such as inflation, public spending, inequality, law and order, where do they agree and where do they disagree? That's next Sunday here on Radio 4 at 10:10. Roy Jenkins and Reginald Maudling, both of whom have been Chancellor of the Exchequer, Home Secretary and Deputy Leader of their respective parties. Until then, goodbye.